Welcome to LabMinutes.com and our lab video series in BGP. You can find complete list of BGP video on our website by clicking on the link above and sign up for our newsletters to receive the latest video updates. In this video, we will be configuring BGP route dampening to alleviate unstable routes, and this includes enabling route dampening on a Cisco router, adjust the route dampening parameters, and selectively enable route dampening on certain routes. Now for our lab topology, we still have 7 routers, R1 through R7, with each of the routers configured with IBGP or an eBGP and their loopback 10 through 12 interface advertised in the BGP. Although we're going to primarily focus on just R1 and R2 in this lab, our starting configuration, we're going to pick up where we left off back in the lab RS0064. So before we jump into our lab configuration, let's first spend some time trying to understand how the route dampening works in the BGP. So the route dampening works under the penalty system. So every time when the route flap occurs on a route, the route will be assigned a penalty, and that gets accumulated as many times as the route flapping. And by default, and I guess it's not so much of the parameter that you can change, the penalty that's assigned to a route flap is 1,000. Okay, some of the terminologies that you need to know is the first one is half-life, which is the amount of time that it takes for a route penalty to drop by half, and by default is 15 minutes. There are 2 thresholds associated to the whole process. One is the suppress threshold, which is the threshold by which if the route penalty exceeds this particular threshold, the route will get suppressed. And the other threshold is the reuse threshold. And when the route penalty drops below this threshold, the route will become usable again to the router. The default value for the suppressed threshold is 2,000, and the reuse threshold by default is 750. Okay, there's also another term, although it's not really shown in this diagram, that you need to know, which is the maximum suppress time. And what it is the maximum time that the route will be suppressed for regardless of the penalty. So although if the penalty hasn't really dropped below the reuse threshold, if the timer or the maximum suppress timer has expired, the route will become usable again. Okay, so just to follow what we have here on our diagram. So the first time when the route flaps happens, the route will be assigned a penalty of 1,000, and it will start dropping. The next time the route flap happens, it gets the next 1,000 for the penalty gets added to the route. And if it flaps often enough so that the penalty or accumulated penalty exceed the suppressed threshold, the route will basically be suppressed or basically stop being used by that router. So at this point, the router would say the route has flapped so many times that it's going to stop using that route completely. And then what's going to do is just going to wait for the penalty to drop according to the half-life timer. And once it drops below the reuse threshold, then the route becomes usable again. So you can see that the green region is where the route is usable. And as soon as you exceed the suppressed threshold, within this red region is where the routes are being suppressed on the router. Okay, so now that you understand the mechanism behind the route dampening, let's go ahead and move on to our lab configuration. In our task number 1, basic route dampening, all we need to do is to enable route dampening on the router R1, and then we need to verify the operation of the route flap dampening. Okay, so in order for us to enable the BGP route dampening on a router, it's pretty straightforward. We get under the router BGP process, and then the command for that is BGP dampening. So you can see it said enable route flap dampening. And then all you need to do is just press enter to use the default parameters. And you can see that you can actually adjust some of the parameters as well as tie it to a route map, which we will look at doing that in the next task. But for now, the feature should be enable, and we can verify that by doing a show IP BGP. And there's a specific option for a route dampening. Some of the options you can do is dampen path, which is the path that's currently being suppressed by the router. You can look at how many times the route has been flapped with this flaps statistic, and then we also can look at the dampening parameter as well, which we are going to do. So you can see since we just pressed enter when we configure those commands, it starts using the default parameters for the dampening, and by default 15 is the 15 minutes for the half-life right here. 750 is the reuse threshold, 2,000 is the suppressed penalty threshold, and then 60 is the maximum suppressed time. Okay, it also automatically calculates for you the maximum suppressed penalty, which is 12,000, and that's based on the suppressed time. So that's basically maximum penalty value that a route can have, so it does not violate the maximum suppressed time and the half-life timer. All right, now to verify our BGP dampening, let's do a debug IP BGP. And we can enable debug for dampening. And then what we're going to do on our router R3, let me just scroll back to the diagram right here. So R3 is currently advertising its loopback 10 through 12 to R1. So what we're going to do is just going to cause the route to flap by no shutting those loopback interface. So let's just pick, for example, loopback 10. Could hop over to R3. And then on interface loopback 10, we can just do shut. You can see there's a log messages that showed up already. And then just do no shut just to bring that route back. And let's review the log real quick. So you can see the R1 felt the route flapping and immediately assigned a penalty of 1,000 to that route. So the cumulative penalty right now is 1,000 because it's the first time the route flap happened, and the flap count is 1. And it's just telling you that the particular route is 3300/24. It's going to have the half-life 15 minutes. And the reuse and suppress threshold of 750 and 2000. So it's just informational. And you can see that the router does keep track of the penalty as it's drop or decay here. So far it has dropped down to 980. And you can just see that it keeps displaying the updated penalty value for the route as it's being decayed. So what we're going to do next is to cause another route flap. So going back to R3 and do shut. Let's see what happened, and then do a no shut. Okay, so we get some more log messages. So another flap cost another penalty of 1,000 added to the existing or current penalty value, and now it has been accumulated to 1927. And it said the flap count is now show up as 2. So you can see at this point, since we have not really reached the suppressed threshold, which is 2000, it said that the route is currently not being suppressed. Okay, so what we're going to do is to give it a couple more seconds, and we're going to cause the third route flap to happen just to push that penalty to exceed 2000 and see what we've got. Okay, so shut. Hopefully we're not trying too soon. And then no shut. And you can see that now the third route flap has happened. Another 1000 penalty has been added, and now the current value is 2845. And that's obviously more than the threshold of 2000. So now we're just going to have to give it a few seconds for the router to figure out that it's time to suppress the route. Right here, so we now have a log message that said the accumulated penalty is 2779. So now the route is being suppressed. So if you go ahead and do a show IP BGP dampening, dampen paths, you can see that we have our R3 loopback 10 as an entry on the table. And it also has a reuse timer tied to that as well. So this route should become usable again in around 5.5 minutes. And now if you do show IP BGP 3300, you can see that the route that's being learned from R3 right here is currently being suppressed due to the dampening feature. And this also has the extra line that contains additional route dampening information for that particular route as well, as far as the current penalty, how many times it has been flapping, and the reuse timer. Okay, but currently since the R1 is also learning that exact same route from R2, then that route is now the only available routes or usable routes, and that's why it's being marked as a best routes. So we just show IP BGP or show IP routes or 3300. You can see that it's currently pointing towards R2. Okay, so just to do the other show command that's available, which is show IP BGP dampening flap statistic. You can see here the output is very similar to the show IP BGP dampening dampen path, and with the addition of the flap counts that's being shown in the table. Okay, so instead of us waiting a couple more minutes for the route to become usable again, I'm just going to go ahead and clear IP BGP dampening. So basically clear the dampening table and release all the routes for the router to start using them. Okay, so now they are clear. I can try to do show IP BGP of the route, and you can see that now once it's been clear, the router has already started using the route that's receiving from router R3. Okay, so that's pretty much our task number 1. Moving down to task number 2 with route dampening parameters. Here we have to configure R1 to make sure the route penalty is dropped by half after 2 minutes. So that would be our half-life of 2 minutes. The route is reused after the penalty drops below 1,000, so that would be a reuse threshold. And the route is suppressed if the penalty exceeds 1,200, and that will be our suppressed threshold. Okay, and the route cannot be suppressed for longer than 5 minutes, and that's our maximum suppressed time. Okay, so basically we're just gonna, instead of using the default route dampening parameter, we're gonna make an adjustment to that, and then we're gonna have to verify and see if it really works. Okay, so we're still dealing with R1. So getting back under the router BGP 100, and then the command BGP dampening. And now instead of pressing enter, just like what we did in the previous task, we're just going to go ahead and configure the half-life time, which we said was 2 minutes. So this is a unit of minutes. And then the value to start reusing routes, that will be a reuse threshold. We said that will be 1,000. And the value of start suppressing a route, that would be our suppressed threshold, 1,200. And then for the maximum suppressed time, we said it's 5, again in a unit of minutes. Okay, enter. Give it a couple seconds, and then we can do a show IP BGP dampening parameter. You can see it's already been updated. We no longer have the word default in parentheses. Half-life time 2 minutes. Maximum suppressed time 5 minutes, suppressed penalty 1,200, and reuse is 1,000. Okay, so what we're going to do is to go through the same process and give it another try. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and shut down loopback 10 on router R3 to cause the route to flap. So go ahead and shut, and then no shut. So the first time around, it should increment by 1,000 as far as the penalty. But this time, the route should decay much faster than before because we're using a half time of 2 minutes instead of the default 15 minutes. Okay, we're just going to give it a couple more seconds before we cause the route to flap for the second time. Okay, we might not have waited long enough, so we're just going to have to keep waiting for a little bit before we can try to flap. You can see that when it tried that the second time, it didn't take effect, so the route couldn't quite see it. It's just that we didn't wait long enough for that. Okay, let's try it one more time. So shut, no shut. Looks like it didn't come in this time either. Say show IP BGP just to make sure we are good on that. So current penalty is 575, and it flapped just only once. Okay, no shut, and looks like it detected the second route flap. So now we are at 1512. Okay, we're going to try to do it the third time too, or actually it's already past the suppressed threshold, which is 1,200. So looks like flapping twice kind of pushes the penalty to exceed the threshold. And there you go. It came back and said the penalty is now 1308. The route is now being suppressed. So if you do show IP BGP dampen path, you can see that the route is currently being suppressed. Same thing, we do show IP BGP 3300. You can see currently the router R1 is using R2 to get to the R3 loopback while the direct route to R3 is being suppressed. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to give a couple more seconds for the route to decay past our reuse threshold, which is 1,000. So right now we're sitting at around 1131. And you can see that we actually went past the 1,000 already as far as the penalty, and the route should come back in a second here. And now that the penalty of the route has dropped below the reuse threshold, the router just went ahead and unsuppressed the route. Okay, so if you do a show IP BGP dampen path, you can see that the table is empty right now because the route that was dampened before or suppressed before has already been unsuppressed. And if you do show IP BGP, you can see that R1 has already using R3 as the next hop. Okay, so we are back to normal, and that's complete our task number 2.